Hello there, it appears we're live now, the webinar is live, so I'd like to welcome you all who have signed in thus far to attend the Revive National Hustings event. Wherever you are in Scotland, it's been fantastic to have you along, and we've got representations from 5 of Scotland's main political parties this evening. And I'm very, very pleased that they're able to make it. We've got a fantastic list of candidates here that are standing in the Holyrood election. So without too much further ado, as I'd like to get to quite a lot of the questions, as there's a lot of them this evening, I would first of all like to just explain the format of the evening. So we're going to start by opening statements from each of the candidates, then we'll take some questions. Each of these, some of these will be pre-submitted by you, and the rest of it from about the halfway point will be taken from the floor itself. So what you'll be able to see is the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So if you click that and try and be nice to our candidates as well, you can ask your questions there. After that, with about 15 minutes to go, we'll move to the closing statements and finish at 7:30. So most of you will probably know about a bit about what Revive's all about. We're a coalition of like-minded organisations, a unique coalition that brings together environmental organisations, social justice, and animal welfare, as well as those with a concern about rapid persecution, in order to come together to bring about grouse moor reform in Scotland. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, who is going to be making an opening statement. This first speaker as well, I believe, is Edward Mountain, has probably attended more parliamentary events than any other MSP that Revive's hosted, so we're obviously grateful for that. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Edward Mountain from the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party.
Thank you, and thank you for setting up the hustings tonight. I'm delighted to take part, and as you said, I often come to the events that you host in the Parliament. Those that know me, and you do, you know that I won't be an echo chamber for all your views. There's much that we will probably disagree on, but I do so based on my experience gained from having spent over 40 years working and managing the countryside. There are, however, some areas that we will agree on, and when we discuss these, I will say that I do. Managing the countryside is a huge challenge. Increasing biodiversity, production, flora and fauna, and dealing with the climate emergency, and who's going to pay for all these issues are the ones that we need to face. What is clear to me is that extremes don't work, and indeed in themselves are damaging. For example, too many deer and hares will prevent natural regeneration of our forests. Abernethy proved this. Pure forestry will reduce the number of species present. The south of Scotland Sitka factories prove this to me as well. The lack of prey variety reduces predator numbers and pressurizes vulnerable species, such as moorland waders. Langham proved this. Poor or limited habitat management creates climax vegetation, creating risks such as moorland fires, as we saw in Murray only 2 years ago. What we need is balance. And there's no silver bullet to solve all the issues facing land managers. And to think there is, I'm afraid, is wrong. Before I conclude, I'd like to say, to find a way forward for moorland management, we will need the grace and charm and realism of David Attenborough, and the open-mindedness and pragmatism of David Bellamy, combined with the experience of those who live and work in the countryside. No one can or should be marginalised, and laws should not be introduced until the arguments have been won. I welcome tonight's hustings and hope during the course of the evening that we will all respect each other's views. Doing so shows that we accept that no one person or group is totally right or totally wrong, which after all is always the best place to start. Thank you.
Edward, thank you very much for your opening statement. I'd now like to introduce Laura Moody from the Scottish Greens, who's a top list candidate for the list ballot in the south of Scotland. Laura Moody.
Thank you. The way we use, own and inhabit Scotland's land is pivotal to our climate action and economic recovery plans. The pandemic has revealed how much we rely on the bonds that tie communities together. And as we emerge from this crisis, we need to reshape our economy to focus on well-being, not profit. Land and how it's used is really fundamental to this. Recently, I led the Green campaign to end peat extraction in South Scotland, defeating 3 applications to extend extraction on sites near Lanark, Beattock and Annan. That process taught me that peat is our greatest reservoir of carbon dioxide, and that those who seek to profit from it are committed to maximum extraction. The Scottish Greens are committed to banning peat extraction and sale for horticultural use, as well as destructive muir burn. As well as damaging our precious peatland, we believe grouse moors cause significant ecological damage. The industry's created a treeless landscape that severely limits biodiversity and involves the routine killing of other wildlife species. For those reasons, as well as our fundamental opposition to blood sports, we support a ban on driven grouse shooting. We need more green MSPs in the next Parliament to ensure licensing of grouse moors is properly resourced and well enforced, that it ends the killing of other animals to maximise grouse numbers, bans the use of barbaric traps and snares, prohibits the use of toxic lead ammunition and medicated grit, and includes strong and workable sanctions that mean licences are removed following repeated wildlife crimes. In the last Parliament, Green MSPs enshrined support of community land and asset ownership in the aims of South of Scotland enterprise. As a result, the recently completed Langham Moor community buyout received £1 million of funding from them. Langham has big plans to create a community-owned nature reserve, promoting positive climate action, community regeneration, and small-scale renewable energy. And finally, we need a new Land Reform Act. However wonderful Langham's buyout will be, it's come about through millions of pounds of public money being handed over to a wealthy landowner who never had to spend a penny purchasing the land he sold. This has to change.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to move on to Ian Davidson of the Scottish Labour Party, who's standing in Ettrick, Roxburgh and Berwickshire and is also on the list ballot. So Ian Davidson.
Fine, thank you very much for this invitation to the hustings. We have published our manifesto today, which is a radical document, a very radical document. In the event that we don't win an overall majority in the Parliament, then we anticipate being willing to work with other parties to make sure that the maximum of our policy is implemented. We, as Labour candidates, are not obliged to give readings from our manifesto or from the words of our dear leader, but I think it is perhaps helpful just to give some indication of the statements that we've actually made, and therefore I would like to quote it. Our manifesto says that going further than the Verity report, Scottish Labour will support the comprehensive licensing of grouse moors as soon as possible, with robust criteria to end the unsustainable practices of driven grouse moors and to promote the sustainable development of our uplands. In particular, our policy commits us to take meaningful action to end the illegal shooting of raptors, outlaw the use of all types of snares, preventing road hill tracks from being built without planning permission, ban the use of lead shot, stop the burning on deep peat, introduce a general presumption against burning on driven grouse moors, and restrict the use of medicated grit on grouse moors, which possibly answers several of the questions which are subsequently to come. Also, in the question of land reform, we say that Scottish Labour will ensure more land is in the hand of local communities to help create a fairer, sustainable Scotland. We will legislate to ensure that no one individual can acquire large swathes of Scotland's land and prevent landowner ownership via offshore tax havens. We'll increase funding for the Scottish Land Fund, using the revenue from seabed licensing and intervening when land is not used in ways that serve the public interest. Public sector agencies should be enabled to participate in land markets with the aim of transferring the land into local vehicles of sustainable local ownership as a basis for local wealth building and income retention. And in order to make my own position clear, in the pledges that I've given to the electorate where I'm standing, I do say that of the 5 points, 2 are relevant here. First is the land should belong to the people. Land reform, taking the land from rich landowners for the benefit of the many, will be one of my priorities. And I also say a ban on hunting with dogs. I support a comprehensive ban on fox hunting with dogs and an end to the killing of living creatures for pleasure. So I hope that that's answered, stated clearly what Labour's position is, and also I suspect has answered many of the questions actually that might come up in the discussion.
Thanks very much, Ian. Yeah, you can log off now. Just joking, but I'd like to just to get things a lot underway. I'd like to now introduce Alan Reid, who's the lead candidate for Scottish Liberal Democrats and the Highlands and Islands. Alan Reid.
Thank you, and I'd want to thank Revive for organising tonight's hustings, and thank everybody who's logged in to listen to us and ask some questions. There needs to be a much better balance in the way we manage land in the interests of animal welfare, biodiversity, the environment, and the future of Scotland's world-renowned species. Many grouse moor managers do follow best practice guidance and take good care of the land they manage. However, the Werity report found that good practice is not universal, so a licensing scheme is needed, and it has to be backed up with the resources needed to enforce the law. A well-drafted licensing scheme will protect responsible operators, and it's important that the work to draw up the licensing scheme is based on consultation that has to be transparent, evidence-based, and involving everybody who has a stake in getting the new system right. Liberal Democrats were part of the first government in Scotland after devolution, and we were instrumental in starting the process of land reform. This has been a very successful policy which has seen many communities gain control of their land, but we have to go further. And we need to expand the land fund to help further community ownership across Scotland, because it's simply not got enough money in it at the moment to satisfy all the communities that want to take more control. It will expand the land fund that will empower local communities to develop and help to repopulate their community. We also need the right to intervene in the public interest when land is up for sale. Local monopolies are definitely not in the public interest. We also need to give the Scottish Land Commission more powers, particularly the power to legally enforce what is currently a voluntary rights and responsibilities protocols, the protocols that govern the relationship between landowners and their tenants and communities. So that's an outline of the general principles, and I look forward to the discussion and answering the questions.
Alan Reid, thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce the last person to make a closing statement, and that is Mary McCallum of the Scottish National Party, who is standing in the Clydesdale constituency. Mary McCallum.
Thank you very much. The climate and ecological emergency is the single greatest long-term threat that we face. The future of our world and everything living on it depends on our willingness to tackle it, and to tackle it very soon. Thankfully, Scotland's Parliament, across the Parliament, passed the world's most ambitious emissions reduction targets in our recent act. And one of the reasons that we could do that is because of the incredible natural resources that we have in Scotland, with the capacity to sequester emission, to produce renewable energy, etc. And that really brings us on to one of the main topics of tonight, because it raises really serious questions about Scottish land use and the change of land use. In 2017, in response to continued incidences of raptor persecution, we commissioned the Werity report. It reported in 2019, and in response to that, we have committed to meeting the recommendations and going further than them in a number of instances, including notably with regard to licensing, which we will not wait 5 years to implement, because quite frankly, we can't afford to wait 5 years. That could make it 8 years. And we think that there is evidence now that self-regulation is not working. So that's One of the things that we'll do will also tackle a number of the other things that I know Revive refer to as the cycle of destruction, including medicated grits and muir burn. And with our friends in the Greens, we've already protected the mountain hare. This is a really complex for many reasons, including different opinions on it, but equally the law, how it's enforced. So there's a lot of work to be done here, but in the Scottish National Party, we're committed to progress.
Madam McCallum, thank you very much for that opening statement. I'm going to head straight to questions now because there are quite a lot to get through. So there are quite a number on Muirburn, and I can only ask one of them. So I'm going to choose one from Alistair Clunas, who has asked, we are in a climate and nature emergency. What is your party's policy on the continuation of the burning of the uplands, which damages habitats and wildlife and releases large quantities of carbon dioxide, all in the interests of a few individuals that pursue a niche hobby? That was from Alistair Clunes. I'll start with yourself, Alan Reid, Liberal Democrats.
Thank you. Muirburn should only be permitted under licence. In a few cases, it may be justified. I mean, regardless of the time of year that it's undertaken and whether or not it's for grouse moor management, then there should only be a licensing, and I mean it would be up to the landowner to make the case and convince the Environmental Protection Agency that it was justified. There should be a statutory ban on burning on peatland, again, except under strictly limited purposes, where if the landowner makes the case that it's needed for to improve habitat. So yeah, a licensing system only allowed in exceptional circumstances.
Thank you, Alan. To Ian Davidson now at Labour.
As I indicated earlier on, our policy is no burning on deep peat, and we would introduce a general presumption against burning on driven grouse moors, and any occasions where that was being sought would be part of the licensing scheme.
Thank you. Thanks for you both keeping the answers very brief as well, as we are, have so many questions. I'd like you to possibly respond, Edward Mountain, if you can.
Well, I think we have to remember that Muirburn's not carried out purely for grouse shooting. It's carried out also for farming reasons. And the reasons why you do it is that you are trying to remove the climax vegetation on the area you're burning. Now, that climax vegetation prevents pioneer vegetation moving in. Now, as pioneer groups of vegetation move in, they lock up more carbon because they're growing quicker. So actually, there is a benefit in some ways from muir burning. I'd also say that not to burn creates all sorts of problems, as we've seen in Murray only last year, or sorry, 2 years ago, when there hadn't been any burning and we had the most amazing fire, which nearly destroyed a couple of wind farms. Some judicious burning, clever burning within the Muir-Burn Code would have stopped that. So I'm with a lot of the speakers here this evening, believe that there should be a strict code. I think there is a code, and I think that people need to stick to that code, and where they don't stick to it, they should be prosecuted for not sticking to the code. It's as simple as that. But it's not just going out and throwing a match onto a bit of heather and walking away from it. That's not what Muir-Burn's about.
Thank you, Edward. Can I have Mary McCallum to respond to the issue of Muir-Burn, please?
Sure, thank you. So Werity recommended that Muir-Burn would be subject to greater legal regulation. In our response, we've said that we will license it in all circumstances all year round. The details of that license will need to be worked out through consultation with all stakeholders. That should probably go without saying, but I'll repeat it now. We will implement a statutory ban on burning on peatlands. We'll also go a wee bit further, and we will conduct a review into the definition of peatlands to make sure that it's strict enough. And if I can just add on the end, we've committed to investing £250 million in restoring our peatlands, with the benefits of sequestering carbon, supporting biodiversity and creating jobs in rural communities.
That's great, thank you, Mary. And finally, on the issue of muirburn, Laura Moody, please.
I could give a quite a short reply to this one. So we would ban the burning of peatlands, and again, have that as broad a definition of what peatland is as possible, because for far too long there's been a lot of confusion over what constitutes deep peat and what doesn't, and that's starting to cause serious problems in terms of forestry especially. And we license any other proposed forms of burning, because while there's arguments that say muirburn would reduce wildfires, there have also been instances of wildfires being sparked due to not properly managed burning.
Thank you all very much. I'll now move to our next question. This one is from Dr. Helen Armstrong. Scotland's uplands, which make up 70% of our land area, are in an ecologically degraded state. This degradation needs to be reversed if we are to tackle the climate and biodiversity crises. Do you agree with these statements? And if so, what policies would your party implement to ensure ecological regeneration of our uplands? Start with Mary McCallum again.
Thank you. It's a great question, and it goes to what I said at the beginning. The way that we use our land and the decisions that we make to change it in the next few years are going to be so instrumental. Just a few things come to mind. I mentioned the 10-year investment that we are proposing to make in peatland restoration. We're also doubling our targets for tree planting because of the climate credentials of that, but equally because of the construction industry and of timber that we're managing to create. But I'll caveat that by saying, we recognise that it has to be a combination of commercial and natural planting. I think that this is probably where some of the land reform work can come into play. Particularly, we've committed to a new land reform bill in which we will look to tackle the problem of scaling concentration that was raised by the Scottish Land Commission in their most recent report, breaking up the land and having more communities able to develop it in for sustainable housing or for renewable projects or for community growing is what I see as the best future for the use of our land. But if I may just say that at the end, I know that there's a preference for a rewilding type project. I agree that conservation and rewilding to a certain scale is positive, but I want to see people living sustainably on our land, and that includes everybody in all walks of life.
Thank you very much, Mary. Same question to Edward Mountain, please.
Oh, I was nearly the first politician or aspiring politician to fail to unmute myself. Look, just on the tree side of it, I'm going to pay a compliment to the government in the last Parliament. They have lifted tree planting and they've done a great job in that. They started off from a very low base, and previous parliaments had failed significantly, and we've moved from 4,000 hectares a year being planted, which basically means that by 2035 we're not going to have enough trees in Scotland to service our forest industry, which is sad and means that we'll have to import it. We're importing 80% of what we use already. So increasing the tree planting target to 13,000 hectares, I think this year is a good thing. But trees won't grow on the highest parts of Scotland, because once you get above about 1,600 foot to 1,800 foot, the tree line means that trees won't grow. And I think there is then a serious issue on those clipped heather hills on how to deal with it, and reducing grazing pressure is definitely one of them. Deer control will be important. And dare I say it, hair control will be important, because that heather takes a very long time to grow. The regeneration cycle of heather on the top of the hills may be 20 years, and therefore you can't afford to have it being heavily grazed. So there's a balance there. So what we would like to see, like all parties, is continued tree planting, but we'd like to see it done in the right place with the right encouragements to do so. And we'd also like to see proper deer management carried out so that there is deer in Scotland, but at a sustainable level.
Thank you very much. And I'll go to Alan Reid for the next answer. The mute function. caught out at this time. Sorry, Alan, it's muted still.
Thanks. I had actually clicked on it, but I couldn't have actually clicked it. I thought I'd clicked on it. I couldn't have clicked on it properly. Sorry about that. Start again. Right. We're proposing a nature recovery law that would set legal targets across the whole of government to clean up our air, land and seas and rivers. We've got to use nature to help fight climate change and foster biodiversity through restoring peatland and woodland. We need to protect and restore carbon-rich habitats like peat. Like everybody else, we agree we need to plant more trees. Our target is an additional 36 million trees every year, at least half of those being native species. In the publicly owned bodies have got to play a role. We'd set a national target that 30% of publicly owned land should be used for rewilding. We'd implement the recommendations of the Deer Management Review to control numbers. And well, we've already talked about the practice of muir burn. So I think there's a set of policies there that would make a significant difference.
Thanks, Alan. I'll go to yourself, Laura Moody. I think if we can all keep the answers as quick as possible, so there's quite a lot to go through. That would be very appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd increase the deer management grant and implement the recommendations of the deer management working group to encourage a reduction of deer numbers, but also sheep numbers via existing agricultural support schemes, by a proposed agriculture bill we'd like to bring in the next Parliament. In the last budget, we secured a £10 million nature restoration fund, and that's money that could be used for projects in uplands, long-term supporters of rewilding, which others have mentioned. And yes, forestry. I live in Dumfries and Galloway, which is roughly 40% forested. That's the level we'd like to see everywhere in Scotland, but we would not like to see everywhere look like Dumfries and Galloway, because a lot of that forestry is mass plantations of Sitka spruce. So we'd want to see 60% of forestry being native species.
Thank you very much, very concise. And finally, to Ian Davidson, please.
Well, I think this is one of the areas where we want to make sure that we've got joined-up policy. And as part of our COVID recovery plan, we have a jobs recovery plan, and part of that is the creation of a Scottish Conservation Corps, which would give us 10,000 new jobs based in the countryside, working on countryside issues. And these would include an increase in peatland restoration to 20,000 hectares a year. It would also expand the tree growing from 11,000 hectares a year to at least 15,000 hectares a year. And as Laura said, we are not in favour of the sort of Sitka spruce plantations blanketing the hilltops. We are in favour of at least 50% of woodland expansion to be with native species.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'll move on to the next question now, which is from someone who wished to remain anonymous, who lives near a grouse moor. They have said, I live near a grouse shooting estate and near a grouse moor and shooting estate, and there are what sounds like 20 or so gas guns in the area. The noise of gas guns and of shotguns in the shooting season is relentless when it happens. It's highly disturbing to my family, and I'm worried that they negatively affect numbers of birds of prey. I need to know what the various political parties intend in doing about them and how quickly they can act. So that's effectively on the sensory experience and situation that some people feel locally when they live near grouse moors. Ian, would you like to start us off there?
Well, I must confess I have no idea what a gas gun is in these circumstances. So let's assume that it's pretty much the same as a shotgun. I mean, I think if we get out of the way and we drastically...
Just to explain, it's essentially, it's often used in agriculture to protect crops and scary things like carrion birds.
Oh, scarers. I mean, like scarers. Ah, sorry, right. I didn't realise that was what was meant. I just presumed it was another means of shooting down birds. I mean, I think we've indicated quite clearly that we want to reduce the prevalence of grouse moors, commercial grouse moor shooting. We want to see the moors being used for other purposes. Personally, I'm against the killing of creatures for pleasure. And in those circumstances, I think that there would be quite a considerable reduction in the usage of grouse moors, and that would solve that problem. That would, as a byproduct of reducing the commercial shoots, then you would have far less sound intrusion into the homes nearby.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'll go to Laura Midiger.
So the short answer is we'd like to ban driven grouse shooting, so there would be no need for gas guns, so that problem would be solved. However, in the meantime, there's quite a lot that could potentially be done through planning. I've been involved recently in a planning battle, really, relating to two proposed shooting ranges planned for Estelmuir near the Sami Ling Tibetan monastery. Last week, the campaigners against it were successful in getting that reclassified and the application withdrawn so it can be resubmitted as a major development, because these piecemeal small applications here, there and everywhere can build up and they can become something that is a nuisance, and noise nuisance is restricted in planning legislation. It's most often applied to a noisy takeaway in a town, but in a rural area, a noise nuisance like that is very disturbing because there's no other noise to absorb it. There's no other sounds. And repeated research has shown that particularly stressful noise is unpredictable noise that people aren't expecting, that's out of place. So I think we need to look quite closely at how the planning system deals with new applications. And in terms of existing sites, I think we're planning to invest in an expanded countryside ranger group as part of our investment in new national parks and improved access to the countryside. And I think you could look at those organisations as having more oversight of what goes on in the countryside and building a relationship with landowners and between landowners and the community about behaviours that can be perceived to be antisocial.
Thank you very much. And to Alan Reid.
Yeah, the right to live without excessive noise close by is very important, and I would think that should be part of the licensing system. I would hope that if shooting was going on close to where people are living, then yes, that should be something that should be taken into account, whether or not a license should be granted.
Thank you very much for your brief statement there. Edward Mountain.
Yeah, on gas guns and scarers. I mean, long-term use of gas guns and scarers doesn't work. I can tell you as a farmer, the wildlife soon get used to it. So actually, it's not a good thing to do. And there are strong codes regarding their use, which means that you shouldn't use them early in the morning and late at night, and they should be turned off at night. And most of them now come with clocks, so you can program them to keep them away. A lot of farmers use them to keep geese away, pigeons away when crops are growing. And actually, it's a very valuable tool. I have to say, in my experience, I've not really seen them used on grouse moors, and I'm not sure what their use would be there. And I think my advice to the person who asked the question: go and speak to the owners of the grouse moor or the keeper involved. And if you don't want to do it, contact me. I'll go and talk to them with you if it's a real issue. But it's not something I've come across being used on grouse moors.
Thanks very much, Edward. And finally, Mary McCallum.
Thank you. I can imagine that's really unpleasant. I have never, would never fire a gun. I really can't sympathise with the idea that is a sport. But whilst we talk about banning grouse moors, I feel like it's not appropriate for people to wake up one day and to be told that their way of life is no longer considered appropriate. So I think what I want to do and what the SNP are committed to doing is to reform and to mitigate the negative aspects of grouse moors insofar as possible, be that environment, be it public health with the concerns about medicated grit, or animal welfare with traps and snares. And that goes for the sensory experience that you're having as well. I like the idea about that being part of the conversation about the licensing scheme.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So move on to a question about land reform now. Scotland has some of the most unequal patterns of land ownership in Europe, and it has been shown that rural economies are suffering for it. How radical should Scotland aim to be with land reform, and how far do your party's proposals propose to take us to that goal. That's from Craig from Clydesdale. So maybe you should start us off with that one, Mary.
Thank you, and thanks, Craig, for the question. I'm ready to be radical. Well, I think that the 2016 Act was radical, and we've spent the last 4 years implementing the terms of it. And so this new land reform bill that we have included in our manifesto, as I said, it's going to be off the back of the Land Commission report on scaling concentration, which for anyone who hasn't read it, quite crudely, if you don't mind, I'll explain it. It basically said that scaling concentration isn't in and of itself always a bad thing, but where it has negative impact, it's very difficult for the community to do anything about it. So I think we need to get in about that. And again, we can do that via looking at public interest tests and by looking at preemptions when titles to land is passed. These are really serious things because I was a property lawyer before coming into politics, and the convention right to property, as we all know, is an important and robust right. And therefore, when we are planning this, we need to make sure that what we're doing is proportionate. But as I say, I'm at the SNP are ready to be radical after our last radical 2016 Act.
Thank you very much. To Ian Davidson.
Boris Johnson said that the Scottish Parliament had been a disaster, and I think that that was wrong, but it has been a disappointment. And one of the particular areas in which it has been a disappointment has been the question of land reform. And I think successive Scottish governments have lacked the bottle to tackle the vested interests that are involved. I mean, I was the chair of the Scottish Affairs Select Committee about 10 years ago, when we produced a report on land reform, which said more radical things than there's ever been said by the Scottish Parliament since. I mean, we said then that we ought to have a complete register. And I mean, we ought to be moving forward to have land taxation. We ought to be seeking to identify foreign ownership. We ought to be prohibiting that. We ought to be doing a whole number of drastic things. And I fear that there's not the will in the Scottish Parliament, and has not been the will in the Scottish Parliament, to seriously challenge the powers that be. I mean, I read the report that Revive have produced, and I think there's two things particularly interesting about that. The first is the where you say that all of those things that are your recommendations can be done with the existing powers of the Scottish Parliament is actually immensely significant. For a long, long time, the response to us and to others who argued for land reform was that, oh, it couldn't be done. It's the fault of the English, or it's the fault of Westminster, or it's somebody else's fault. They're not giving us enough powers. We can't help it. We haven't got, et cetera, et cetera. That is clearly not the case. There is no excuse, in my view, for not progressing. But the other point about the report that you've produced, I think that you're not sufficiently dynamic in terms of what you're saying. You call on the Scottish Government to explore various things, and I think that there's 27 times in the recommendations you recommend that things should be considered rather than acted on. I mean, we need to have a coalition, a dynamic coalition, which actually is arguing that this should be a priority. And it seems to me that for too long, there's been foot dragging on land reform, and that Scottish Labour and myself are certainly willing to be part of any coalition that moves forward as speedily as possible to drastically reform land ownership patterns and all that that means in Scotland.
Thank you very much there, Ian. It is a big question, so I understand there's quite a lot to say here. Obviously, it can be as big as possible, but that was brilliant. No, thank you. So I'll go to yourself to respond to that, Edward Mountain.
Thank you. I'll keep it short, if I may. We as a party believe that it's not who owns the land, it's how it's used that's absolutely critical. I'm going to agree with Ian. Let's have a register. I'm really up for it, and my party's up for that. So everyone knows exactly who owns what, Ian. It's a good idea, isn't it? And you can check my register to find out exactly what I own. 500 acres of arable land, in case anyone's wanting to know. And I think we've got to be also realistic, though. with land ownership, there are huge costs involved. And we need to make sure that when we're empowering communities, which I'm in favour of where it's needed, that the resources that they need to carry out what is needed to be done are there, because they're much bigger than you anticipate, and we anticipate as a group. So I'd like to be really open and honest, and I'd like to know exactly how much a community plan is going to be for ownership, because we haven't always seen it, and we've seen communities who have empowered and bought their land struggling for finance thereafter. So if we're going to empower them to do it, we're giving them a huge burden and a responsibility. We've got to make sure that when we do it, they have the cash to follow it through.
Thank you very much, Edward. Laura, maybe?
It's really good to hear that there's a lot of enthusiasm and shared will for improving the current land registration system. We'd really like to see that, and make sure any land register is free and transparent, and it covers ownership, use and designation. So that's something hopefully we can bring forward in the next Parliament. I'm also going to agree with Edward about community land ownership. I've been involved in several community buyouts, community land or asset transfers, and they're hard. I think the Greens are calling for a review of community right to buy and community asset transfer to make sure the legislation works, because in a lot of cases it really doesn't. The valuation of land is a big challenge in that context, and people paying potentially over the odds, and support, long-term support for people carrying up through these projects, as well as the money to actually buy the land in the first place. Obviously, we want to bring forward the Land Reform Act to tackle monopolies and promote better and fairer management of land. We also want to commission a review of taxation and subsidies relating to land ownership, regulate the sale of land, and require significant land holdings to produce transparent land management plans, so as a public interest test. We'd restrict overseas land ownership and give what are currently land rights and responsibilities statements a statutory footing, so that people have to act responsibly rather than just being asked nicely to please act responsibly. But there's so much here. I could talk all day just on land reform, but I'll leave it there for now.
Much appreciated. Thank you very much. And just finally, Alan Reid.
Yes, we want to see more land in the hands of the local communities. So the first thing we would do would be expand the Scottish Land Fund to help more community ownership, because there is the demand among communities to own their own land, but the Land Fund has in recent times been oversubscribed, so that needs to be expanded greatly. We need the right to intervene in the public interest when land is being sold, because it's undoubtedly the case that local monopolies of land just aren't in the public interest and are detrimental to the local community. We need to give the Scottish Land Commission the power to legally enforce what is currently a voluntary rights and responsibilities protocols. That's protocols that govern the relationship between landowners, communities, tenants. That should be on a statutory footing. I agree with previous speakers that we need an open and transparent land register. We can't really tackle this issue unless we actually know who actually owns the land, who is the beneficial owner. So I think that those are a series of proposals that I think would take forward land reform to the next step. So there seem to be widespread agreement, particularly over the register. So I think that's something we can look forward to in the next Parliament.
It's going to happen, and that's fantastic. So I'm going to do, because I've only got a few minutes left for the pre-arranged, pre-submitted questions. So I'm going to go for a couple of the shorter ones first of all, and if you can answer each in just a sentence, that would be very appreciated. Will the candidates commit to their parties' MSPs actively supporting a ban on the sale and use of snares over the next Parliament? I'll start with yourself, Alan, Reid. Just a sentence.
Well, the answer is it wouldn't be a complete ban. What we need more regulation. I think that the existing regulations on traps and snares should be supported by a requirement for training. That nobody should be allowed to set them unless they are trained, and then after they are trained, they should apply to the local police station for a reference number, and the code they get would have to be put on all traps that they set, so that if a trap is not set properly, we know who did it. And we need this obviously will have to be monitored. And I mean, there already is a wildlife crime unit in Scottish Police that needs to be beefed up, given more resources, so that if anybody is going out there and setting traps that aren't being set properly according to the code, then that should be a criminal offence.
Thank you very much. So very much on the regulation front there. Mary McCallum?
Yeah, we can't ban it outright, because they do need to be used in some circumstances. However, we've already got strict rules. We introduced vicarious liability as part of the 2020 Animals Act, and we've committed to strengthening it further under the licensing scheme that we're going to bring in for grouse moors generally.
Thanks very much. Laura Moody?
Yep, we've banned the use of spring traps, snares, stink pits, decoy birds as bait, and cage traps. And to refer to what Alan was saying about wildlife crime and the police, we'd also like to extend the powers of the SSPCA, so they're more enabled to investigate and prosecute wildlife crime.
Thank you very much. And finally, Edward Mountain, please.
The simple answer is no. And just to clarify something that Alan has said, to be able to operate snares, you have to have been trained, you have to go on a course. Every snare has to be marked and recorded with a number which is issued by the local police station, and they have to be checked regularly. I'm perfectly relaxed about more records being kept, and there are records of everyone who's gone on a course. And I'm relaxed about more wildlife crime officers. I don't think that's a bad idea at all. I'd be happy with that.
Thank you very much. And I suspect you've already told us, Ian, but your response to that?
Yes.
Yes, simply banning. Thank you very much for the most concise answer of the night. So we have one final question before we go to the floor, and if we can also answer this really quickly, if possible. Hundreds of thousands of that's probably more in a similar vein. I'll go to this one instead. Do you accept that it was the continuing illegal activities of mainly the driven grouse shooting fraternity, as well as investigations work done by RSPB Revive League Against Cruel Sports, that has made licensing inevitable? I think essentially did some elements of the driven grouse shooting community bring licensing on themselves, I believe is the essence of the question. I'll go to yourself, Edward Mountain.
No, I don't accept that, but let's be quite clear. I'm just going to make a statement now that anyone who breaks the law and doesn't follow the law when it comes to managing wildlife deserves to be prosecuted and deserves a book to be thrown at them. And I've been criticised for not making that point clear enough. I made that point clear. I've made it clear and on all the meetings that we've had in the Parliament, and I'll make it clear every time I speak. If you break the law and you're contravening wildlife crime legislation, then go to jail. Pay the fine and go to jail. Happy to say that and be clear about it as well.
Thank you very much, Edwards. Ian Davidson again.
Bad behaviour has enhanced support for licensing, and quite understandably so.
Thank you very much. Alan Reid.
Yeah, I'd agree with what Edward and Ian have said. We need we need the licensing system, and it has to be followed up. I've already said earlier, I think we need to beef up the Scottish Police Wildlife Crime Unit. That bad behaviour ought to be caught and punished.
Thank you very much. Mary McCallum.
Yeah, so the question is, has the behaviour of some of the industry led us here? Well, yes, it has, because some of the industry are still persecuting raptors, and that's absolutely abhorrent. We have introduced vicarious liability, set up poison disposal schemes, put restrictions on licenses, and recently ramped up the penalties for being caught. And yet still this year, in particular during lockdown, we've seen continued instances of it. So licensing is very much required, and that is because of the actions of a minority, no doubt, but still part of the industry.
Thank you very much. And finally, Laura Moody.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's clear. I've seen locally repeated violations of regulations and rules, which have gone unpunished effectively, or certainly not punished to the degree that makes them not worth doing. I think a lot of people in the industry would acknowledge that they brought this on themselves, and that's sad. You know, there are gamekeepers, there are people who work in the industry who are trying to be more environmentally and ecologically aware and work really hard on that, and they know that their life is being made more difficult by people repeatedly breaching the law. So yeah, licensing is inevitable, and the industry really only has themselves to blame.
Fantastic, thank you all very much. That ends the segment on pre-submitted questions, and we're now I'm now going to introduce Louise Robertson, consultant from Message Matters Media, who is going to bring the audience's questions to the floor. So welcome, Louise.
Hi there. So there's a few questions have come in over the course of this evening. So I'm going to take two together to start. The first one is from Ruth Tingey, and the second one's come in by email, so don't have a name, but they're both on raptor persecution. So the first question is, golden eagles continue to be illegally killed on grouse moors in Scotland by trapping, shooting and poisoning. Nobody has ever been persecuted for these repulsive crimes. What would the candidates do to bring the criminals to justice? And the second question is, what are your proposals for dealing with wildlife crime and raptor persecution in particular?
Great. We'll start with Laura Moody then.
Very nearly forgot to unmute there, so apologies for that. Yeah, it's intensely frustrating seeing the numbers of birds of prey, and especially golden eagles, being harmed, and seemingly quite clear indications that this is being carried out on estate lands, and a blind eye is being turned. So yeah, detection of the crime is rare, prosecution even rarer. We believe Police Scotland could do a lot more, but they do need resourcing for that. So we'd resource a wildlife crime investigation unit that would be dedicated to investigating persecution and enforcing protection, and ensure that there's adequate wildlife crime officers in every region, because that's another issue quite often they're hearing about over a lot of landscape. We'd like to see greater use of existing sanctions, including the removal of licenses. I can't stress that enough. It's exhausting seeing the same landowners getting prosecuted time and again and nothing being done, and make specific provisions to allow consideration of video evidence by the Crown Office and the Procurator Fiscal in cases relating to wildlife crime. Again, because wildlife crime officers, however well resourced, can't be everywhere, but there has often been good video footage and other evidence that is not admissible currently.
Thank you very much, Laura Moody. Can I go to Edward Mountain, please?
I guess at the end of the day, I sit and when I read about an eagle being found killed or dead, it's heartbreaking to me, because I think they're one of our most iconic birds in Scotland, and it's the last thing that I'd want to see. In fact, I took part in a project to reintroduce eagles into Ireland, and along with various raptor groups and the RSPB, eagles were caught on an area of Scotland that I was looking after and moved over to Ireland. And the sadness was when they got there, they then ended up being killed there as well. So I just cannot believe it goes on. And so I would, again, like to see more wildlife crime officers. And it is quite clear, we know where most of our eagles are nesting, and we should take care of them. And I would urge, I don't think it just comes down to the police, but also the people who look after that land, keepers, farmers, and those people who have vested interest by going up there, keep their eyes open and report things to the police, because it's got to stop. It's just not acceptable.
Thank you, Edward. To yourself, Mary McCallum.
Thank you. Well, I hope, I mean, I listed off before some of the history of where we've come to get to the point where the licensing scheme is going to be introduced if we're re-elected. And I hope that will have a big impact, because I want to see it be a zero tolerance approach, whereby licenses are granted, and if it is proven that there has been a breach, then they are taken away. And I think that will have a big effect. We are supporting the police already, and there is already provision to set up to look again at SSPCA powers and the extent to which they can assist the police. I think that there's more that can be done in the satellite tagging. That seems to me like an underused resource that could be helpful in data sharing and in monitoring the live whereabouts of the birds at the time. But I just want to try and challenge this notion that we're not doing enough. I think this just goes to the heart of how difficult this issue is to prosecute. And it's very similar to when we talk about the difficulties in prosecuting domestic crime, for example. It's about a lack of witnesses and evidence. So we are trying to pull every lever we can, but this is an incredibly difficult issue.
Thank you, Mary. Alan Reid?
Oh, it's an appalling crime, and it ought to be dealt with. But I mean, Mary did make a good point that, like domestic violence, actually procuring the evidence can be difficult. So what I already said, I would want to beef up the wildlife crime unit, but I accept that getting the evidence can be difficult. So I'd want to talk to the wildlife unit, see what changes in the law we could make, see what changes in practices we could make. Also want to talk to the Crown Office. I mean, I don't understand why they won't accept the video evidence. So I'd want to talk to them about that and see what we can do, because this is an appalling crime that we really must make every effort to stamp out.
Thank you very much. And finally, Ian Davidson.
Well, clearly the government's not doing enough, because the fact is that the crimes are continuing. I mean, domestic violence has been curbed largely because more attention has been paid to it, more resources have been devoted to it, and that's what we need here. I mean, I think Labour are saying that we want to have a full review of the outdated animal welfare legislation to try and review, to move forward on a new basis. But apart from that, I would completely agree with all the initiatives that Laura in particular was suggesting, and Labour would support those.
Thank you very much. That's brilliant. Can I move to yourself, Louise, for another question or so?
Yeah, so the next question has been submitted by Cathal de Lima Hutchison, and it's been directed at Ian Davidson, but I think we'd probably like to invite every member of the panel to respond to the question. So the question is, given much land is already highly concentrated among a few large landowners, are you willing to support a progressive land taxation system and also higher tax on non-domestic and second homes to change that?
Ian Davidson.
Yes and yes.
Concise as always. In that case, we'll move straight to Edward Mountain.
I think we need to be really careful about taxing and basing tax on land ownership. For example, only go to the West Coast, if you like, and see some of the farms there that are very marginal farms, could in some cases be crofts and croft ownership owned within a crofting township. If you're going to base it on an area, then the tax could be punitive and could drive the crofters out. And where we got it so wrong, and where the government got it so wrong, I think in the last Parliament, is when they introduced sporting rates. Because what they did when they rushed in to introduce sporting rates is that they made sure that the two biggest ratepayers for sporting rates would be the Forestry Commission, or Forestry Land Scotland, and SNH, both of whom are large reserve holders. Now, that clearly wasn't what they were intended to do. So I'm not sure that land taxation is the right way forward if the aim is to redistribute land. I think it's more progressive to encourage people to own land and therefore to use community land purchase as the way forward.
Thank you very much. Go to Laura Moody now.
Yes and yes again. In the meantime, we'd look at using the planning system to reduce the number of second homes and to acquire second homes to have planning consent to reduce rural depopulation.
Thank you very much. Alan Reid?
Yeah, I think we have to look at the way we tax land. I think we have to look at putting the emphasis more on the value of the land rather than the rateable value. So we definitely need to. We definitely did an inquiry into this, because I mean, I think Edward made a good point. You have to be careful, or you can have the law of unintended consequences can kick in here. So I think I would want to see an inquiry into how we could use the taxation system to encourage a more equitable use of land. But and I think it should be based on land value. But we don't have any concrete proposals, because it's something that is very complicated, and we have to be careful. But there certainly should be an inquiry into how we could use the taxation system to help a more equitable use of land.
Thank you very much. And Mary McCallum, do you think some land tax could be part of the Scottish National Party's land reform bill with something coming?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the idea, and I know Alan said that we need an inquiry. Well, in the SNP, we would rather put it to the people. So we have pledged to create citizens' assemblies if we're re-elected, and I think that this is an issue that most certainly would be best discussed and decided among a wide variety of people in the public. Just a couple of other things about the tools that we can already use that we've got. So when stamp duty land tax was devolved to Scotland, we created land and buildings transaction tax, which we designed to help people buying a first home, but equally we created the additional dwelling supplement as a tax on a second property. And secondly, we are going to bring in a housing bill if we're re-elected, which among other things will seek to empower councils in tackling second home ownership where that's a problem in the area. And also, which I'm really interested in, bringing derelict homes back into use. I think particularly in rural parts of Scotland, that will be very helpful indeed.
Fantastic. I believe we've got time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions before the closing statements. Louise, could you give us the next one if that's all right?
So the next question is from Beryl Leatherland, who is asking, how would you address the significant problems resulting from the proliferation of inadequately regulated hill track construction and ATV use associated with intensive grouse management and shooting?
Fantastic. So I'll go to, first of all, Ian Davidson. Oh, you have to unmute yourself, I'm afraid.
We've said that we would prevent road hill tracks from being built without planning permission, which seems to me to cover the position.
Thank you very much. Laura and Moody, would you agree with that?
Yeah, agriculture and forestry tracks need to be brought back into the planning system effectively.
Fantastic. And how do you feel about that notion, Edward Mountain?
I think we need to be careful on hill tracks, because they are actually already within the planning system, and the planning system can actually be used when it comes to hill tracks. So they have to be notified, and the council, if they took action when the notification came in and said that they didn't want them, they could call it forward to inquiry. So the powers are there. So it's a question of whether the council use them. And I'm absolutely amazed that Ian's cat is joining in, a bit like Ian Blackford's dog. I think the last one is quieter there. So I think the power's there. And I would just say that I know we're short of time. I'm really happy to cut my closing remarks down to 30 seconds if it allows more questions, because I think the questions are more important than statements from politicians.
That's very appreciated.
Likewise.
Fantastic. And I'll go now to Alaric, please, for your views on that.
Yes, I think that it has to be regulated through the planning system. I think there should be a legal requirement for landowners to apply for planning permission before constructing tracks on land that's used for stalking and shooting within important areas like national parks, sites of special scientific interest, national scenic areas.
Right. And the last word on hill tracks, Mary McCallum.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I agree with these being regulated in a past life, as I said, I was a property lawyer, and I dealt a lot with renewable energy projects, and the extensive work that had to be done in order to prepare for the tracks for wind farms really stands in contrast, I think, to some of the unregulated work that goes on in grouse moors. So I think there should be parity. And just, it's slightly off topic, but I think one of the things that we need to work on this year on the topic of access is about returning us to having this good relationship with our worldly famous access rights and between landowners. I think the pandemic has created a bit of anxiety around it all. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm seeing more do not enter blocked off areas than I ever have before. And I think that we need to all work together to get to a point to reduce that anxiety and to share our right of responsible access across the countryside.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for those responses on hill tracks. One of the areas of Reviv's so-called circle destruction. And Louise, could we have the next question, please?
Sure. So the next question is from Les Wallace, who is asking, shouldn't the proposed licensing scheme for grouse moors require that all possible methods to reduce flooding downhill, including peat bog restoration, targeted tree planting, and planning for the return of the beaver, be fully implemented, or is shooting birds for fun more important than keeping homes dry?
Right, I'll go first of all to Manny McCallum.
Thanks for the question, Les. I think it's a good one, and you've basically pointed to all of the ways in which, you know, we can use our land to make people's lives better, to help us be resilient against the climate emergency. Should all these things be in the licensing system? I'm not sure we would have much success with that, but as I said, I think that we're moving into a period where, if re-elected, we will have to have a robust consultation with all stakeholders on this, and you know, I don't think there's any ideas off the table, and I think that it should be incumbent upon landowners to manage their land in a way that does help the watercourse, which does support biodiversity and help with the climate emergency as well. So very interesting ideas.
Thank you very much. How would you respond to that, Laura Moody?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure this fits in well with the licensing system. What the Greens are proposing are new land management contracts, which would reward farmers and land managers financially for delivering natural flood management solutions, because we know the answer to a lot of flood management is in better management upstream of land. I've seen that. I'm from Yorkshire. I grew up quite near Pickering, which as a community worked together with local landowners to address repeated flooding. And instead of building gigantic flood defences, they worked with landowners upstream to improve land management so that flooding hasn't happened in Pickering in more than a decade, I think, and it used to be an annual occurrence when I lived there. So there's lots that can be done, but we need to support landowners and tenant farmers especially to deliver that kind of change.
Edward Mountain, how would you respond to what we've heard so far?
I think it's really interesting. We've come full circle. When I was much younger, the government was paying people to drain the uplands. They were actually paying them to put grips in across the hill to get the water off quickly. And now we're paying them to fill those grips in and to keep the water up there. And you know, we've changed a lot in forestry as well, because in the forestry days, the up and down ploughing that went on before the trees were put in just allows the water to cascade off. So there's a huge amount that we can rectify, but we're actually rectifying our own mistakes. So I think we need to take every possible precaution. I don't think it falls within licensing. And I would just make the observation as well is we should never forget that every time we put in a wind farm, and there's a lot to be said for wind farms, I believe offshore rather than onshore, the amount of concrete that goes into the base, the amount of tracks that are put in to allow those wind farms to go in actually speeds water coming off the hills. And what we should be doing is finding ways of slowing it down. So I'm up for any discussions on any of these things. I think rectifying our mistakes on the peatlands and in the forestries would be the first place I'd start.
Thank you very much. Ian Davidson, how would you like to respond to Les's question?
Yep. I think it's a very constructive and positive suggestion. It seems to me that if you wish to control the use of land, it really comes down to a question of will. Is there the will to utilise the levers that are available to bring about certain results? And it seems to me that using the licensing system to assess priorities is actually a very constructive way forward. You see, I can see no reason why a licensing system shouldn't be used to say that grouse moors or something else is not an appropriate use of this land, given the alternatives and given the general public interest. And therefore we will refuse a license for this particular piece of land to be used as a grouse moor because there are better purposes for it. That seems to me to be entirely reasonable and in line with the sort of rules that we apply during the use of the planning mechanism. I also think that using the licensing system to influence the value of land is also a very constructive way forward, because one of the issues about land purchase, or either on behalf of the communities or on behalf of the public in general, is that very often the value of that land can have been inflated by other public policies which have made it, well, for example, the provision of general subsidy obviously makes it more valuable as a commodity. If it's the land which attracts subsidy, the value is therefore higher. You therefore have that land value being driven up in the face of a community wanting to buy it for perhaps another purpose and maybe not being able to afford it. So it seems to me that using the licensing system, widening it out to consider what alternative uses are, is a very constructive and positive way forward.
Thank you very much, Ian. And excuse me. Finally, Alan Reeds on Les's question.
Well, I think the management of land, I mean, particularly management of water courses, I think that's better managed through the agricultural support system, through land management contracts, where we pay the farmer to do environmentally positive things. I think it's best done that way, rather than through. I don't think grouse moor licensing is the way to pursue that. I'd also planting trees. That would have a tremendous benefit in reducing flooding, because I mean we all know that when trees get cut off a hill, the next thing is you get the flooding. So I think land management contracts and tree planting is the way forward.
Thanks very much. I think we've got time for another couple of questions if we're quick. Louise, what might the next one be?
The next question is from Fiona McKinnon, who asks, there is plenty of evidence that grouse moors offer poor economic advantage to local people in rural areas. Many other jobs could be created in wildlife and land management or tourism if this murderous pastime were no longer happening. Do any of the panelists want to stop this activity?
Yeah, I'll go first to Mary McAllen, Scottish National Party.
I'm always first. This is no, I think it's a really good point, and I do have concerns about some of the research that I've seen of late, which demonstrates both what the workers in grouse moors are being paid and also the way that they feel about their job, about the way that they're being treated. I don't think the answer is pulling the rug from under their feet, though. And I think that we always need to remind ourselves that this is not always just about the large absentee landowner. This is about people who work in these areas, who live in fragile communities, whose kids go to school and who contribute to the wider local economy. So I would love to see conditions for these workers and pay for these workers improve. I suspect there are a great number of jobs that can and should be created in the rural economy which would serve them better, but just pulling the rug from under their feet isn't the answer.
Thanks very much. We won't be first next time, don't worry, we'll mix it up a bit. Ian Davidson, please. I
don't think anybody is suggesting that all of these jobs should be swept away overnight. Or that people would, I think to use a quote somebody said, wake up one morning and find that their way of life has been changed. I mean, I think that's absurd. I mean, I think that that's not a serious suggestion at all from anybody that I have heard. However, that shouldn't be used as an argument against change. There will obviously be difficulties in any transition, but transitions have got to be managed. Transitions are not going to argue that be the reason why we don't say do anything about North Sea oil and gas, for example, the fact that there'll be transitional difficulties. We've got to manage transitions, looking after the interests of the workers involved and making sure that alternative employment opportunities in the countryside are made available. Now, one of the interesting things about Brexit, irrespective of your general views, but one of the interesting things is that the change in the state aid rules do mean that there's opportunity for money to be provided by either Scottish Enterprise or your Highlands and Islands or South of Scotland Enterprise for local projects to try and add value to the products of the countryside in a way that creates jobs which have not been available up to now. I mean, I remember again, looking back to my Scottish Affairs days, we were struck by the extent to which HIE and the Scottish government were absolutely paranoid about the danger of possibly being referred to the European Commission by providing state aid and being pulled up for it and so on, completely unnecessarily. And when we spoke to the EU, they said that, look, they are gold plating these regulations. So now that those regulations are away, we can look at ways in which we can try and increase employment in the community by alternative means of value adding. And of course, we've got to make sure as well that the things that we indicated earlier on about new trees, repeating, as it were, that the conservation corps that we are proposing to establish with 10,000 jobs, there are a whole number of jobs that could go to people already working in the countryside. If we are serious about increasing education for people in the urban areas about what goes on in the countryside, why they should not be involved in dirty camping, why they should not their dogs run loose and so on, more tourism, more walking, I mean, all sorts of things. There are going to be jobs there for people who have got the skills that gamekeepers and others have got at the moment. So a managed transition, I think, is what we're all looking for. I mean, I like Edward, participated in the hustings that the Scottish Gamekeepers Association had not all that long ago. I think we were, as we are now, on pretty much different ends of the spectrum. But I think that what we were clear about was that we've got to take account of the needs of the people in the area. And I would be it would be very helpful to all concerned if we had clarity from both the Liberals and the SNP as to who are the real spokesmen, because the spokesman for the Liberals and the SNP, Fergus Ewing and Katrina Batty, said completely different things to the gamekeepers from the things that are being said by Alan and Mary here today. So we've got to be clear about having a consistent policy. I think both Edward and I have been consistent. We've disagreed, but we've been consistent. We can't accuse the Greens of not being consistent because the gamekeepers didn't even invite them. But I think it's important that people know that when spokespeople from parties are saying things, it's the same story that's being told right across the board, and not just one thing to one group and a completely different thing to a different group.
Okay, I'll briefly get back to Alan Reid to respond to then.
Well, first of all, I am not the party spokesperson. That is Katrina Batty, as she wasn't able to come tonight, and I am representing the party. But I mean, everything that I've been saying has been from the party briefing. I don't accept what Ian's saying is that I haven't been following the what's in the party manifesto.
No, I don't think Katrina was.
I'm sure Katrina was following the manifesto too, but I think we probably, rather than having this disagreement, we probably better get on to answering the question. Well, the answer to the question is no, I wouldn't ban the grouse shooting. I think it should be licensed, but we do want to. We have to regenerate the rural economy, and that means investing in rural areas by the land fund providing the money for communities to buy land. Then I would like to see Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Scottish Enterprise, supporting the community to create jobs with the land that they've purchased. we also need to invest in the infrastructure in rural areas, getting super fast broadband rolled out everywhere, for example. And there are plenty of places where we need to improve transport infrastructure. It's by investing in rural areas, and we'd also be creating jobs in land management by reforming the agricultural support scheme to be paying farmers and landowners to carry out environmental projects. Workers will be needed to carry out those projects. I will be, obviously, everybody is saying we're going to be planting a lot more trees. That requires workers. So I think the answer is not to ban the grouse shooting, but to create jobs in other areas. And then if the owners of the grouse moor aren't prepared to pay a wage that's as good as can be obtained in the other jobs that we've helped to create, then they will go out of business because they won't be able to employ the workers, because the workers will have gone to better paid jobs. So the answer is to invest in the rural economy, not ban grouse shooting.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to move first to Edward Mountain, then Laura Moody.
Okay, first of all, I would actually contest that keepers aren't paid a fair wage. I think they are paid a fair wage, and they often, as part of their package, get their house, their vehicle, and various other parts paid, for example, council tax. So I actually dispute that they're not well paid. They have long-term contracts in a lot of cases, and the problem is, I accept that people may want to stop grouse shooting. It's not something that I want to do. But, you know, if you say, well, we're going to employ them in planting trees and such like, planting trees happens once every 40 years or 30 years. And the operations between those periods are actually quite limited. So I don't believe that they are badly paid. I think grouse shooting and field sports brings a huge amount into the country. I don't have exact figures for all of grouse shooting. Let me give you an example. Fishing on the Spey, which flows past my door, brings in £120 million a year. Sorry, 113, I'll get this right. Fishing as a whole across Scotland brings in £113 million. The Spey brings in about £13 million to the economy and employs 346 people. If you ban that, think of all those jobs, they'd be really hard to replace. So I think Mari's right in the sense that you can't just ignore the people. The people here have got real jobs, long-term jobs, and they're well paid. And not all of them well paid, but a lot of them well paid. And I think we should take that into account.
Thank you very much, Edward. And finally on that, Laura Moody, brief if you can be.
Yeah, I think my friends in forestry and woodland management will be fascinated at the idea that they plant a tree and then they put their feet up for 40 years. Quite a lot goes on to looking after woodlands. We would ban driven grouse shooting, but we would also invest in rural jobs. We'd want to invest at least 895 million over the next 5 years, which would create 6,000 green jobs. Almost all of them would be rural. So that would be our £150 million nature restoration funds, which would help us to improve habitats like wetlands, rivers and coastlines, 250 million more for national and regional parks, 250 million for community native woodland planting, 100 million for rangering and biodiversity systems, 145 million to restore peatlands. These are really good jobs, rural-based jobs, and all of them would add more to their economy than grouse shooting does, which has been repeatedly shown to add very little to the economy, especially in rural areas. Even look at the Langham buyout. You know, they're taking this land that has mostly been used for shooting parties, and they're going to have renewable energy, they're going to have ecotourism, they're going to have peatlands, they're going to have a nature reserve, huge diverse choice of jobs in a rural community, and that's essential.
Thank you very much. Louise, are there any quick fire yes or no questions? I'm not sure if there might be, but if there are, the time to ask them.
Yep, this could be a yes or no answer. So this question is from Kirsty Jenkins. As part of grouse moor licensing, does your party support a review of wildlife management practices based on a framework such as the International Consensus Principles for Ethical Wildlife Control?
Okay, start with Laura Moody.
I'm not sure it's worded exactly like that in the manifesto, but yes, broadly yes. And I'm going to have to say, I've actually got another thing I need to go to, so I'm going to forego my final statement to give others more of a chance to answer these questions, and I might well drop out all of a sudden. So thank you very much. It's been great questions, and I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'll go to yourself, Edward Mountain, now.
I'm going to be totally honest here that I don't know my way around the international consensus principles for ethical wildlife control. So I can't commit to doing something or speaking on the subject I don't know anything about. I will read up about it, and I will come back and give you an answer once I understand the question. I'm sorry, I feel inadequate being able to answer it, but I'd rather not try and answer something I don't understand.
I can also say that's very fair enough. Alan Reid, can you give an answer to this at all?
Well, again, I have to admit I haven't read up on the international consensus principles for ethical wildlife control, but any licensing scheme would definitely be based on ethical wildlife control.
Okay, thank you very much. Ian Davidson?
On this question, I am as ignorant as the others. However, assuming that it is a generally good thing, then how could we be anything other than in favour of ethical treatment?
Fantastic. And finally, Mary, ending in you this time.
Thank you. I'm starting to wonder whether Laura is actually as familiar with it as she appeared to be, because it appears the rest of us aren't. Ethical sounds good to me, but I would want to see it before saying yes.
Okay, well, maybe what we can do is after this is done, we can arrange to send it to the panelists and maybe get a response from you then.
Please do.
That sounds good to everyone. Seeing as that's almost time up, I'd like to do the closing statements, and this we're going in reverse alphabetical order of political parties this time, so that means we do start with yourself, Mary, again. So if you're able to give your closing statement, please, that would be great.
Yeah, happy to. First of all, thank you so much for having me, and it's been really good to be part of this tonight. We commissioned Verity. We will implement it, and we will go further and faster than was recommended. That's not a government who sits and gets by the minimum of what it has to do. That's a government that is proactively seeking to address the abhorrence of wildlife crime. We're doing that whilst pursuing the world's most ambitious climate targets, and we are seeking to do that in a way which supports a green recovery from COVID, including by peatland restoration, which I mentioned, forestry, building 100,000 affordable and energy efficient homes. These are all projects which will stimulate our economy and help us reach net zero. And if I'm elected, I'll be fighting to get those opportunities into the constituency. And of course, I wouldn't be an SNP representative if I did not point out that we are doing all of that whilst offering you a choice on your future to have the full powers over our economy and society to build the kind of country that we all want to live in.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Mary. I'd like to now move to Alan Reid.
Well, to turn to the topic of tonight, I mean, as far as grouse shooting is concerned, we don't believe in banning it, but we do believe in licensing it. So we would implement the recommendations of the Verity report. We do need to create a much better balance in the environment. We need to have much more biodiversity. We need to have good standards of animal welfare. And I believe that a well-drafted licensing scheme does protect responsible operators. We would have an extensive consultation exercise before introducing it. It's got to be transparent, evidence-based, and we have to involve all stakeholders. Land reform is also very important. We want to see much more land reform, expand the Scottish Land Fund. Land sales should be in the public interest, and we need a transparent land register.
Thank you very much indeed. Now to Ian Davidson of Scottish Labour.
Thank you. I joined the League Against Cruel Sport at the age of 12 when I was in Jedburgh. And I think that gives an indication of my views on grouse moors and on fox hunting and on related matters. I think, as I indicated earlier on, that the Scottish Parliament has been a great disappointment on these questions, particularly in relation to land reform. And I think Revive have done a public service by identifying all the things that could be done with existing powers. So there's no longer any excuse for hiding behind, oh, we can't do this, we can't do that, a bad boy's stopping us from doing it. It's quite clearly the case that much, much more could be done now on land reform. Now, if the SNP and a coalition of other groups, whether it's Alex Salmond or the Greens, bring forward proposals to have drastic and considerable land reform, we will support that. And if they don't have a majority, we will seek a majority to bring forward drastic land reform, because it seems to me that if we want to make the Scottish Parliament work, then we've got to make sure that we regenerate Scotland after COVID in so many positive and radical ways. That's why we've got a manifesto which emphasises rebuilding, and the jobs element of that will greatly impact upon the countryside by providing not only the conservation core, the work that's going to be done there in relation to peat, trees and the like, but also value-added manufacturing and the processing of agricultural produce. That's the way, in our view, to regenerate the countryside. Thanks very much for inviting me, and vote Labour.
Thank you very much, Ian Davidson. And the final word goes to Edward Mountain.
It's perfect to have the final word. First of all, thank you very much for organising this evening. I've enjoyed it. It's been open and honest, and we've had a variety of questions put to us, and we've all come up with some answers, some of which we agree on, some of which we don't agree on. But it's healthy, that, in my opinion, because the two sides working together to find a solution, a pragmatic solution, is the way forward. I will always remember what I'm told is no one has the absolute right to say that they have the answer, because everyone has an answer. And we need to remember, as we come to that answer, that our land are places of work for many people. And our countryside provides a huge and valuable part of the Scottish economy. And it's also so important to the many families, not only within that countryside, but adjacent to the countryside or who come to the countryside, who rely on it for their livelihood. Now, the next Parliament's going to be interesting, but I think that we all have a responsibility, whoever gets in there, to resolve the issues that we've been talking about tonight, finding a solution, and not to do so will be a true failure. Now, my party believes, as I've said, on various things this evening, and I think that what I would bring to this Parliament and lots of my fellow party members is true experience from having worked and got dirt under our fingernails in the countryside, finding solutions and managing it to the best of our ability. So I would repeat what Ian says, but vote Conservative, not Labour. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that closing statement, and from all of you. We are at the end of the hustings. I'd like to thank all of you, the candidates, plus Laura Moody, who's already left us, so much for coming at what I believe was a fantastic event, and it was fantastic and really interesting to hear your views. I'd like to thank you all very much for the questions, but and I'm very sorry we couldn't get through all of them. There were far too many, far too little time. I believe we could have gone on for another hour and a half. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you all very much. Stay well, have a happy election, and I look forward to seeing a good number of you in the near future. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Okay, thank you.
Bye, everyone.